Tonight we slip quietly into the warm, candlelit courts of the 12th century, where velvet drapes flutter in the breeze, rosewater perfumes the air, and grown adults are preparing for verbal combat with compliments. No steel, no blood, just sonnets so sharp they leave reputations in ruins. You're seated on a cushion, a fig in one hand, listening to two poets try to outflatter each other into poetic submission. It sounds silly, right? Until you realize that one wrong word could mean exile, or worse. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far we stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through a crowded bazaar, spice smoke clinging to your sleeves. Somewhere behind the stalls of dyed silk and brass lanterns, drums beat softly. Not war drums, court drums. They call nobles, scholars, and curious eavesdroppers to tonight's poetic duel. You slip through the crowd and enter a tiled courtyard, where two men stand robed in silk, hands folded, eyes locked, not with hatred, but with an almost flirty determination. The duel begins. Your soul, one poet begins, is so luminous, the moon asked me to dim my lantern in shame. Gasps flutter through the audience. Not because it's romantic, but because it's clever. Because it dances on the edge of parody. Because everyone knows everyone, his calling his rival a pale, predictable cliché. And that's the first strike. This isn't your usual rap battle. These aren't insults. Not directly. This is a battlefield where the sharpest weapon is admiration. Compliments become a language of subversion, and victory goes to whoever can flatter with such grace. Their opponent either blushes into silence or collapses under the weight of veiled mockery. You sit back, heart beating slowly with the rhythm of rhyme. You're not watching poetry. You're watching fencing. In the 12th century, especially across Persia, Arabia, and parts of the Islamic world, poets weren't just entertainers, they were elite verbal athletes. They could turn praise into policy, flirtation into political alliance, and ridicule into roses. Court life revolved around poetry like modern life revolves around streaming apps. Sultans didn't just want warriors and advisors. They wanted someone who could make them sound glorious in 12 lines or less. Historians still argue whether the compliment battles were more theatre or real competition. Some say poets exaggerated their rivalries to stir up drama and keep audiences invested, like medieval influencers gaming the algorithm. Still, the stakes were real. A compliment poorly timed or too obviously biting could lead to exile. Or worse, your stipend cut. Imagine Netflix cancelling you for a haiku. These verbal duels weren't always two-person events either. Sometimes, they were performed as rolling chain duels, one poet tossing a glowing metaphor into the air, and another twisting it mid-flight into a wry counter-compliment. You didn't need swords, you needed stamina. One famous example involves the court of Sanjar, a 12th century Seljuk sultan. His court poet, Anvari, was notorious for compliments so layered they required a spiritual guide and 3 dictionaries to unpack. In one verse, he praises a rival poet's sweet tongue but cleverly rhymes it with words that suggest serpents, honey traps, and dangerous lies. The crowd cheered. The rival, not so much. But not all poets were mean-spirited. Some used this compliment dueling to genuinely admire each other, just competitively. Like, your eyes are sapphires that outshine the ocean's vault, and yet still not as bright as my verse. You know. Friendly backhanded admiration. And here's the twist. Many of these poets were friends in real life. Or frenemies. They traveled the same circuits, dined at the same courts, sometimes even mentored one another. So these battles were performances, half affection, half ambition. One quirky tidbit. Some poets actually wrote compliment dueling manuals. Yep. Like a 12th century version of a how to win a roast battle guide, except you're learning to weaponize praise like, compare his voice to silk, but question its strength. You glance back into the courtyard. The second poet steps forward. His voice is low, deliberate. Your talent is so bright, he begins, that the stars once gathered to ask for your autograph, and left disappointed. A ripple of laughter, genuine, amused, impressed. The compliment hit first. The insult arrived 1 second later. Perfect timing. A boy nearby tugs his father's sleeve, whispering, "Did he win?" The father shakes his head. Not yet. Because this wasn't a single volley game. These battles stretched for hours. Sometimes days. Onlookers judged, kings nodded, and occasionally, someone dropped a purse of coins on the winner's cushion. One particularly bored governor allegedly promised a summer villa to whichever poet could make him laugh while praising his rather hideous hunting dog. It took 4 hours and 23 metaphors, but someone walked away with a beach house. Not that everything was about prizes. Poets were celebrities, yes, but fragile ones. Their reputations teetered on every line. So they practiced obsessively. Night after night, alone in candlelit rooms, muttering to themselves about moonlight and lions and fingernails like crescent blades. Even the structure of the poetry mattered. In Arabic and Persian poetic forms like the qasida, praise had a whole section to itself. You'd start with love or nostalgia, weave into compliments for your patron, then end with a deep sigh about the state of the world. Basically, ancient emotional roller coasters with exquisite scansion. One poet described a rival's voice as so golden it melted the chains of grief. Which is lovely. Until you realize he's implying his rival sings about sadness all the time, probably because he is sadness. Sneaky, huh? But these weren't just poetic exercises, they were social rituals. You flattered your host, sure, but you also flattered his horse, his city, his mosque's architecture, and even the calligraphy on the invitations. Miss one, and it was like forgetting to compliment someone's shoes at a wedding. And occasionally, poets pulled punches. Or tried to. There's a tale of a young poet who nervously told a princess, "Your hair is like a night without stars." Which sounds romantic. Maybe. Except that meant super dark, kinda empty. He was banned from the palace. For a year. Still, despite the high stakes, something about it all feels playful. Like watching two cats paw at each other with velvet gloves. And as you lie there now, surrounded by whispered verses and lingering incense, you realize this wasn't a fight to hurt. It was a fight to be clever. A duel not for dominance, but for elegance. The crowd claps quietly. The poets bow. Tomorrow, the duels will resume. You follow the poets as they slip out of the courtyard, sandals brushing the stone floor, laughter trailing behind them like spice smoke. They're done performing, for now, but their words linger, curling in the corners of your thoughts. You catch yourself grinning. Because somewhere between the veiled digs and velvet praise, you realized, that was fun. Dangerous, yes. But fun. So you trail behind them, through a warren of tiled halls, until you emerge into the cool moonlit quiet of a Persian garden. Water trickles down narrow channels, feeding rosebeds and fig trees. The poets are gone now. But here, among the jasmine and stone benches, is where it all began. Persia, in the 12th century, wasn't just a center of poetry. It was poetry. You can't step 2 feet without tripping over a metaphor. Even the wind smells like a verse someone whispered 100 years ago. And in cities like Nishapur, Herat, and Shiraz, poets weren't just praised, they were worshipped. You sit beneath a cypress tree, brushing petals from your lap. Here, compliments weren't shallow social niceties. They were performance, currency, flirtation, and sometimes, just sometimes, an emotional confession buried beneath layers of artful exaggeration. It's in this land of literary obsession that you meet Sanai. Now, Sanai's not just any poet. He's the literary great-uncle of Rumi and one of the first to blend mystical Sufi spirituality with romantic and courtly praise. He writes poems about the divine that also sound a lot like his describing someone's unbelievably symmetrical cheekbones. Which, honestly, might have been the point. Historians still argue whether Sanai's praise poetry was truly devotional or just a clever way to sneak spiritual ideas past censors by disguising them as love songs. Either way, it worked. Kings nodded. Sufis wept. And rivals fumed into their beards trying to outdo him. But Sanai wasn't battling just anyone. The Persian court system in the 12th century was crawling with poets. Think of it like a reality show, but everyone's got an ink-stained sleeve and a chip on their shoulder. Praise someone too well, and your rival might accuse you of flattery for hire. Hold back too much, and suddenly you're a cold fish with no poetic passion. It was a balancing act with a lute string's tolerance for error. You hear footsteps on gravel behind you. It's Anvari again, the same sharp-tongued court poet from last night. Except now, he's alone, scribbling lines into a scroll by moonlight. His muttering. Your beauty makes the sun hide behind clouds. Pause. But your arrogance makes it shine again, out of spite. He chuckles at his own joke. You do, too. Quietly. This isn't for the court. This is for himself. Practicing for the next duel. Or maybe preparing a poem for someone whose attention he wants, but doesn't dare ask for directly. Here's a quirky tidbit. Persian poets were obsessed with eyebrows. Like, genuinely. Eyebrows show up more than swords in most court poems. Descriptions like brows arched like a drawn bow or brows thick as loyalty weren't just compliments, they were status symbols. A person with perfect eyebrows? Probably had the whole court at their feet. You wonder, staring at the reflection of moonlight in the garden pool, how much of this flattery was real. Did they believe the people they praised were that divine? That perfect? The answer is both yes and no. Compliments in Persian poetry worked like brushstrokes in a miniature painting. They didn't aim to portray exact truth. They aimed to make beauty believable. To make the idea of someone as magnificent as the stars feel possible, even if no one actually believed it. And yet, praise could also bite. It could humiliate. Imagine someone writing, "Your wisdom outshines the candle I use to find my sandals at night." Sounds like a compliment. Until you realize, yeah, that candle's not very bright, is it? So Persian poets learned to read the texture of a line. A compliment was rarely just a compliment. It had shadows. It had echoes. That's what made it thrilling. You shift against the cool stone bench. Somewhere, a nightingale sings. There's another layer to this whole thing, of course. Love. The real, aching kind. Hidden in all this public praise were private passions. Poets often slipped real desire into their verse, disguised by metaphors. That radiant rose in springtime? Yeah. That was someone's crush. Someone they maybe weren't allowed to name, much less marry. Historians still debate whether these passionate poems were autobiographical or performative. Did poets fall in love with their muses, or just the idea of them? Did praise turn into actual obsession? Some scholars argue Persian poetry blurred the lines between divine love and earthly longing so completely that even the poets couldn't tell the difference after a while. One poor guy, whose name has mostly vanished, reportedly complimented a noblewoman so beautifully that her fiancé challenged him to a duel. The poet apologized by writing another poem. That one described her as distant as the seventh sky, which sounded poetic, sure, but also functioned as a legal disclaimer. And if you were really clever, you'd praise someone else entirely to make your true subject jealous. Imagine writing a sonnet for a rival's donkey just to spite them. That actually happened. In a particularly petty moment, a poet once described his rival's mule as nobler than the king's courtiers. The rival never recovered. This is the Persian poetic playground of the 12th century. Fragrant, fierce, and full of elegantly disguised chaos. And maybe what makes it so dreamy, so dreamlike even now, is that everyone's playing by the same rules. Compliment to win. Praise to provoke. Say it sweet, but say it smart. You press your palms to the warm stone bench and rise. Somewhere deeper in the city, another poet is warming up. Another courtier is preparing to host. And someone, somewhere, is about to have their ego shattered by a perfectly crafted compliment. The garden behind you hums with night sounds. You walk back into the labyrinth of the city, heart a little lighter, eyes a little sharper. There's more to see. You wake to the scent of saffron and dusty scrolls. Morning in the city hits softly, sunlight sliding across mosaic tiles, doves fluttering from minarets, and somewhere, the sound of a poet rehearsing under his breath. You stretch, crack your neck, and remember why you're here, to witness how, in this strange slice of the 12th century, the compliment is a weapon. You duck into a tea house. It's small, half-shadowed, full of smoke from someone roasting almonds over a brazier. The conversation? All poetry. All the time. A group of poets is deep in debate, slouched over their tiny glasses of cardamom tea. One of them slams his hand down dramatically. You cannot praise and insult in the same breath, he insists. Oh, can't you? The older one asks with a smirk, and quotes from memory. Your words are pearls strung on a crooked thread. You smile. That's it. That's the whole technique in one line. Praise on the surface. Jab underneath. Elegant as a dagger in a silk sheath. This is what you've come to see, how compliments, in the hands of 12th century poets, weren't innocent. They were strategic. Like fencing. You didn't just say something nice. You set traps. You twisted meanings. You gave with one hand and took with the other. In courts across the Islamic world, from Persia to Baghdad to Egypt, poets made their names on this technique. The compliment as combat wasn't a side dish. It was the main event. Here's the formula. You lift someone up so high they start to wobble. Then you gently knock the pedestal. One famous example comes from a poet named Kakani. He's invited to a royal court and asked to praise a minor prince. He writes, "Your honor is like a mirror, bright and blinding. But mirrors crack when stared at too long." The room freezes. Is that a compliment? Or a warning? Even today, historians still argue whether Kakani was showing reverence or delivering the poetic equivalent of a loaded pistol. What we do know, the prince didn't speak to him for a year. So, probably leaning loaded pistol. Poets didn't only use words to wound. Sometimes, they used praise to trap. Say a rival was trying to worm his way into a royal court. You might get ahead of him not by insulting him, but by praising him too much. Ridiculously so. He is so generous, you might write, he once gave away the moon. The tides still haven't recovered. And just like that, your rival is stuck looking either vain, if he accepts the praise, or ungrateful, if he rejects it. Boom. Checkmate. This kind of psychological jujitsu was everywhere. Poets turned language into battlefield terrain, and compliments were the mines hidden beneath wildflowers. One fringe tidbit. Some poets created fake praise poems about themselves and released them anonymously. Essentially medieval sock puppeting. Oh no, who wrote this incredibly generous verse about me? I'm humbled. And suddenly everyone's talking about how loved and admired you are. Imagine planting fan mail like a PR campaign, but in couplets. You sip your tea and watch as the older poet pulls a scroll from his sleeve. This, he says proudly, is how you compliment someone and crush them at the same time. He unrolls it and reads. He speaks like honey. Thick, sweet, and hard to clean up after. Someone snorts tea out of their nose. The younger poets scribble notes like students at a roastmaster boot camp. Because here, the line between flattery and humiliation is razor thin. Misjudge it, and you're just being mean. Hit it right, and you're legendary. But not every battle is fought in public. You hear whispers of secret poetic duels, complimentary verses exchanged privately, between rivals too elite to squabble in front of the court. Sometimes written on perfumed paper, sometimes etched into the inside cover of a shared book, these hidden battles were never meant for crowds. One such story tells of two poets competing for a vizier's favor. One writes, "You shine so brightly, I fear the stars will resign." And the other answers, days later, "Then let them resign, what is starlight but envy poorly disguised?" Each line is beautiful. Each one, lethal. And neither man ever names the other. That's the true genius of this age, no need for insults. The compliment does the dirty work. You slip outside the tea house into the sunlight. On the wall, someone's pasted up a fresh poem. The ink still glistens. His wisdom is like the sea, vast and full of secrets. But beware, many have drowned trying to find the bottom. You chuckle. Compliments weren't always aimed upward, either. Sometimes, poets used them to punch downward. Not out of cruelty, but out of ambition. If a minor poet got too bold, a court veteran might praise him like this. His verses are simple and pure, unclouded by the burden of complexity. Which sounds nice. Until you realize it means, your work is basic, kid. Historians still debate whether the culture of compliment as combat encouraged more talent or just more ego. Did it sharpen the craft? Or turn it into a status game? Probably both. Because make no mistake, status mattered. Complimenting someone beneath you could be either a generous act or a calculated show of dominance. "Look how magnanimous I am," the subtext reads, "I even compliment the help." But sometimes, a compliment was just a compliment. Pure and kind and healing. You hear about a poet, sick and exiled, who receives a letter from his old rival. Inside is a short verse. "Even the rose misses your voice. Come home." No sting. No irony. Just love in verse. That's the other edge of this sword. Praise could also mend. You walk toward the courtyard again. The sun's high now. The poets will gather soon. Their verses will sparkle. Some will sting. But every line will be wrapped in the silky armor of admiration. Compliment or critique? Sometimes it's impossible to tell. Which, frankly, is the point. The courtyard buzzes again. Different poets today, but the energy is unmistakable. You can feel it rising off the tiled floor like heat from a blacksmith's anvil. Except, of course, the weaponry here is all metaphor and meter. You find your usual spot in the shade, settle in, and eavesdrop. A young poet, barely old enough to grow a mustache, steps forward. He's holding a folded piece of parchment like it might explode. He clears his throat. To the great master Jalal. Your poetry is like spring rain, nourishing, inevitable, and soaking everyone, even those who did not ask for it. The crowd titters. A polite laugh. A nervous one? You can't tell. Jalal raises one eyebrow so sharply it practically whistles. This, dear listener, is compliment as challenge, a special breed of poetic combat. It's not open mockery. It's not even subtle insult. It's a tone, a look, a twist of metaphor that says, "You're great, sure, but maybe not as great as you think." It's how upstarts earned respect. Complimenting a master just enough to appear humble, but slipping in a sideways nudge to prove they weren't afraid to spar. There's a very fine art to this. You think of it as poetic hazing. New poets entered a court and had to earn their place, not just by praising others, but by proving they could walk the tightrope. Say something bold within the rules of reverence. Flatter without groveling. Provoke without offending. Here's where it gets messy. Historians still argue whether courts encouraged this playful edge, or merely tolerated it to avoid looking fragile. One camp insists that rulers delighted in watching poets jostle for position. Another insists most courts just wanted safe, predictable praise, and only the bravest bards dared push further. Either way, the tension created a whole genre of performance poetry, the kind that starts with adoration and ends with a mic drop. Like this gem from the poet Sadi, written to a nobleman. You are wisdom's chosen vessel. But even chosen vessels must be emptied and cleaned. That line still gets quoted in some Persian classrooms. Because it's funny, smart, and ever so slightly audacious. The kind of line that makes you grin, even if it's aimed at you. But this wasn't just about cleverness. Compliment as challenge served a deeper purpose. It tested the listener. Could they handle nuance? Could they laugh at themselves? Could they spot the deeper message buried under the buttercream frosting of praise? You watch as Jalal, the elder, finally responds to the young poet's line. He steps forward, smooth as oil on glass, and delivers this. Ah, the rain. Sometimes soft, sometimes flooding. And yet, without it, no weeds could thrive. Boom. The crowd gasps, then erupts into laughter. It's not cruel. It's warm. A nod of respect, laced with playful dominance. And just like that, the challenge is answered. You realize, this is the game. The entire poetic world of the 12th century operated like a medieval comedy roast if everyone wore silk robes, spoke in rhymed couplets, and occasionally invoked metaphysical theology mid-burn. And don't be fooled, this wasn't just for men. Records from Andalusia to Baghdad reveal women poets who wielded compliments with even sharper edges. One famed poetess, Warleda bint al-Mustakfi, once wrote to a suitor, "You are a moon in the dark, bright, but distant. And I have learned to sleep in the dark." Cue the dagger drop. Women like Warleda had fewer public stages, but when they stepped into the arena, they didn't waste time with subtlety. Their compliments were fierce, fast, and loaded with autonomy. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe Warleda sewed her own lines of poetry into her clothes, literally wearing compliments she wrote for herself. A walking declaration of worth, strutting through a society that often tried to mute her voice. Now that is branding. Back in the courtyard, the poets continue their verbal fencing. An older gentleman with a beard like tangled vines rises and proclaims, "The vizier is a jewel. Sharp, precious, and too valuable to touch without gloves." You watch his eyes. There's admiration there, but also a glimmer of distance. Is it sarcasm? Is it envy? Or is he just tired of pretending to like the vizier? That's the delicious uncertainty. You start to notice how poets pair physical beauty with moral commentary. They'll say someone's lips are sweet, but their tongue is sharper than a falcon's talon. Or that their eyes dazzle like stars, but stars burn those who stare too long. Compliments become moral mirrors, reflecting both light and shadow. And if you look closer, you see how these poetic battles mirrored actual court politics. Praising someone too obviously, you might be accused of seeking favors. Being too cryptic, you risk being misunderstood. But strike the perfect balance, and suddenly the vizier chuckles, the scribe nods, and the crowd murmurs approval. It's verbal alchemy. Historians still can't agree whether poets had more power than they appeared to. Some say they were tools of the court, ornamental, disposable. Others insist they shaped reputations, stirred unrest, and whispered revolutions inside their rhymes. You suspect both are true. Because praise, when delivered cleverly enough, could change someone's fortune. Or ruin it. There are stories of poets exalting a minor courtier into sudden promotion, or jokingly praising someone's laziness so brilliantly that they were fired out of sheer embarrassment. The lines between truth, fiction, and social manipulation blur. As the sun slides lower, the crowd thins. You follow one poet down a quiet hallway. He turns to you and says, as if continuing a conversation you didn't know you were having, "The sharpest compliment wounds only the foolish." Then he smiles, and disappears into a doorway. You stand there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around you like velvet. Because now you understand, compliments weren't just expressions of admiration. They were tests of character, games of status, acts of rebellion, invitations to connection. They were, in the 12th century, the most dangerous art form no one saw coming. And this journey, it's only just beginning. Later that evening, the lanterns blink to life one by one, stretching golden fingers across the marble floor of the garden court. You sink into a carved wooden bench, your legs just beginning to forgive you for all the walking today. Nearby, poets begin to gather again, but this time, the tone shifts. It's no longer about public cleverness or courtly showdowns. Tonight, you're stepping into the murky, seductive waters of rivalry disguised as reverence. You hear it before you see it, a quiet, breathy voice murmuring verses near the fountain. He is the candle, and I the moth. Drawn to his brilliance, scorched by his warmth. A few listeners nod appreciatively, but others exchange knowing glances. The candle line? Classic code. It sounds like admiration, but in the poetic circles of the 12th century, candle metaphors usually burned both ways. Because that's how praise worked in poetic rivalries, you wrapped your critique in petals. You called someone dazzling, yes, but too hot, too distant, too short-lived. Praise with an asterisk. A velvet boxing glove. Historians still debate whether these poetic feuds ever escalated into real conflict. Some insist it was all artful performance, a stylized wrestling match with rhymes instead of bruises. Others argue that reputations, patronage, and even marriages were affected by how well or how viciously a poet could wield their compliments. You lean in as another poet responds with a smirk. If he is the candle, then I am the mirror, reflecting his light and doubling the glow. A subtle flex. Still reverent, but sneakily self-centered. Compliment turned boomerang. This is what makes the 12th century poetic world so slippery. Even when praising a rival, you're also praising yourself. Indirectly, of course. Humbly. But with just enough gloss to suggest, look how clever I am for noticing their brilliance. That little twist. That's the whole game. You begin to recognize a pattern in these exchanges. Compliments often come in the form of metaphorical hierarchies. A lesser poet might call a rival the sun and himself a planet in orbit. That sounds submissive, right? But wait. If he's a planet, he moves. He travels. He's essential to the system. The sun, it just sits there. Glowing. Stationary. Lonely, even. Suddenly, what looked like flattery is a resume. Some poets got more inventive. One likened his rival to a sword, sharp and cold, while calling himself the scabbard, warm and necessary. Another compared his competitor to a lion, fierce but rash, and himself to the hunter, careful and silent. And here's the kicker, the audience loved it. They weren't just listening to pretty words. They were playing along, deciphering the metaphors like guests at a puzzle dinner party. One fringe tidbit. Some poetic duels even became public games where the audience would vote silently on who delivered the sharper compliment in disguise. Court scribes would record the best exchanges, and if a line caught fire, it might be copied across cities, carried by merchants, and immortalized. This wasn't about winning. It was about becoming unforgettable. You wander over to a quiet corner where two poets sit cross-legged by a pomegranate tree, scrolls and ink pots between them. They're working together, not against each other, on what's called a shared praise verse. A kind of poetic tennis match where each line lifts the other person higher. You, whose words make the desert bloom, and you, whose silence humbles kings. They nod at each other, half grinning. It's beautiful, but it's also competitive. Each line pushes the bar higher. Compliments layered like chess moves. Each poet trying to say, "Look how much I admire you," and also, "Look how amazing I am for writing this line about you." You start to appreciate how rivalry and reverence weren't opposites here. They were symbiotic. Poets needed each other. Your enemy was also your best marketing. If a rival wrote a verse about you, however veiled, you were officially relevant. That's why some poets courted rivals on purpose. They'd throw out a provocative compliment just to spark a feud. It was strategic self-promotion. A way to get your name on everyone's tongue without ever begging for attention. Kind of like starting a Twitter beef, but with more rhyming and fewer emojis. You even hear stories of poets inventing imaginary rivals, just so they could write grand, dramatic verses of praise and appear noble for not retaliating when, nobody actually said anything. Genius. And also slightly unhinged. Remember Kakani? The poetic pistol packer from earlier? Well, he once wrote a full sequence of complimentary verses to a rival who never responded. Historians still argue whether this was genuine admiration, or just a long, elegant subtweet that never got noticed. The line between sincerity and strategy blurs again. You settle onto a stone bench, and an older poet sits beside you, brushing dust from his robe. He speaks softly, not looking at you. True rivalry is a kind of love. You must care deeply to want to outshine. And just like that, it clicks. These veiled compliments, these crafted rivalries, they weren't just games of wit. They were relationships. Intimate, charged, and often tinged with equal parts jealousy and admiration. Rivalry disguised as reverence wasn't just about winning. It was about being seen. Because in a world where words meant power, to be praised even ambiguously was to matter. Even if the compliment carried a thorn or two. And so, as the moon rises and lanterns sway in the breeze, you begin to understand something fundamental about these poets. They weren't just battling each other. They were battling for legacy. Every carefully twisted compliment was a monument to both ego and connection. You look up and smile. Because now you see it clearly. In the 12th century, to rival someone was to write them into history. And to praise them was to tie your story to theirs forever. The next morning, your sandals crunch lightly across the tiled path of a newly awakened garden. Dew clings to the edges of pomegranate leaves. Somewhere, a reed flute hums its lazy greeting to the rising sun. But before you can reach for a fig or settle into your usual bench, a messenger passes briskly, scroll in hand. Another poetic exchange is making the rounds. But this one's different. This scroll doesn't praise a person. It praises an object. Yep. Today you're diving into one of the strangest quirks of medieval poetic battle, complimenting inanimate things as a sneaky form of social maneuvering. You might think praising a silk robe or a wine cup is just fluff. Something pretty to pass the time. But in the 12th century, poets used these object praises, called mad alashi in Arabic or simply item eulogies, as glittering proxies to flatter powerful people without naming them directly. Like a love letter to a mirror that just happens to be owned by the Sultan. You pause under an orange tree and unroll the scroll. O sandal, kissed by the noble's foot. You tread upon carpets embroidered with the stars. Lucky leather, blessed to bear such a weight of glory. Now, is the poet actually in love with a shoe? Nope. They're praising the person who wears it. But not directly. It's safer this way. It's clever. It's layered. And it's just ambiguous enough to keep the poet out of hot water if things go south. Historians still argue whether this was a survival strategy or just creative flair. Some believe court poets used object praise to navigate shifting political alliances, others say it was a way to add mystique and distance, like tagging someone in a compliment, but doing it in invisible ink. You smirk. Because this kind of praise sounds fancy, but it's really the medieval version of saying, "Wow, this teacup is amazing," while staring at your crush across the room. And don't think this was limited to royal courts. Merchants, scholars, even rival poets became the subjects of these poetic object compliments. One scroll from 12th century Aleppo sings praises of a writing quill. You dance across parchment like wind over dunes, spilling thoughts nobler than the thinker's own. Translation: Dear scribe, you're not the genius here, your pen is. Which is hilarious. And also savage. You wander into the scriptorium where scribes copy verses onto vellum with painstaking care. A dusty manuscript sits open on the desk, filled with odes to a goblet. One passage reads, "O chalice, round-bellied and bold, you know more secrets than a priest." Fringe tidbit: some poets got weirdly specific. A Persian poet once wrote 27 verses about a lantern. Another, a full ode to a carpet. Not just the craftsmanship, no, they praised the carpet's loyalty, its endurance, and even its emotional intelligence. Yep, the poet claimed it knew when to muffle footsteps and when to sing under heel. And then there's the bizarre case of the water jug duel in Nishapur. Two rival poets were vying for the same patron. Instead of insulting each other, they each wrote odes to the same bronze water jug sitting in the patron's garden. One poet praised its clarity and truth-holding purity. The other praised its weighty dignity and curved wisdom. The jug didn't care, obviously. But the patron? Delighted. He gave them both gold. Because that's the thing, object praise wasn't just artsy nonsense. It was currency. A way to demonstrate elegance, discretion, and rhetorical flair without stirring up actual drama. And sometimes, it was satire in disguise. There's one famous case from Al-Andalus where a poet praised a palace gate so lavishly that people realized he was actually mocking the prince's obsession with security. "O gate, wise guardian of silent halls, you alone have heard the prince's thoughts, and wisely kept them locked inside. OOF. Burned by your own doorknob. You chuckle quietly, stepping past a group of boys practicing their handwriting in the courtyard. One of them recites a line about a spoon. A spoon, smooth servant of the sweet. You never speak, yet always offer. And just like that, it clicks. This kind of praise is playful camouflage, an art form designed to both celebrate and subvert. Sometimes a spoon is just a spoon. But in 12th century poetry, a spoon might stand in for loyalty, elegance, or your patron's underwhelming charisma. Historians have recently unearthed anthologies containing entire sections of non-human praise: peacocks, incense burners, sandalwood boxes, mirrors, cats. Always tied, somehow, to the people who owned or touched them. Like tracing fingerprints through metaphor. One scholarly debate rages over a famous quatrain praising a cloak. Was the poet admiring the weaving? Or subtly flirting with the person who wore it? There's no consensus. But that cloak has been discussed for 800 years. You pause beside a quiet fountain and close your eyes. The whisper of water reminds you of another object praise line you saw etched into a marble step. This basin holds not just water, but reflections of men too proud to kneel. Compliment or critique? That's the fun of it. Because in this poetic world, objects could carry all the emotional charge of a love sonnet or a political hit piece. They were safe stand-ins. Or sometimes not so safe. And when a poet really wanted to be sly, they'd praise an object belonging to someone else's patron. That's right. A sideways challenge. A sort of poetic flirting with someone else's king. Risky? Sure. But the best lines always flirted with danger. You open a scroll you picked up earlier in the market. Inside, an ode to a belt buckle. It's short, but brilliant. You clasp the noble waist with ease. I envy your grip. And that, you realize, says everything about how 12th century poets mastered the compliment. Whether directed at a rival, a ruler, or a rug, praise was always layered. Always strategic. And never ever just about what it seemed. Later that afternoon, you follow the scent of rosewater and baked bread to a small tiled hall tucked between the gardens. A young performer beckons you inside, finger pressed to her lips. This is no ordinary poetry reading. This is a compliment duel, a lyrical face-off where praise is weaponized for show. Two poets are already seated on embroidered cushions, scrolls in hand, but neither reads a word. They recite from memory, from heart, from ego. This is what you've been waiting for. Compliment duels weren't the most common form of poetic exchange, but when they happened, they were unforgettable. Part showmanship, part courtship, part psychological chess, think rap battle meets Shakespearean charm offensive, with a dash of verbal wrestling thrown in for good measure. The rules? Flexible. The delivery? Rhythmic, often in paired couplets, like a metered dance. The winner? Decided by sighs, smirks, or, sometimes, a loud ooh from the crowd. The first poet bows slightly and begins. He walks, and the wind pauses, awed by his stride. His shadow teaches shade how to hide. Dang. That's a powerful opener. The air actually shifts in the room. But the second poet, older, calmer, lifts a hand with a lazy grin. He speaks, and silence writes him down. A tongue so wise, it humbles the crown. You hear someone gasp. Yeah, that was a good one. This back and forth isn't just about praise. It's about control. Each poet compliments someone, sometimes the host, sometimes a third party, sometimes even each other, but always while subtly raising the stakes. It's a fine line. Go too soft, and you sound dull. Push too hard, and it starts to sound like flattery for flattery's sake, which, in this world, was a poetic crime. The challenge is to praise in a way that outshines the praise itself. Historians still debate whether these duels had standardized forms. Some say they were mostly spontaneous. Others argue they followed an unwritten code of metaphors, sun-moon, mirror-light, fire-water, passed down through generations. And yet, you spot patterns. One poet compares a rival to honey, but another trumps that with saffron. Another calls someone's voice a melody, only to be followed by a line that turns that voice into a symphony written by angels. Compliment escalation. Sweet and savage. You sit cross-legged now, completely absorbed. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some cities, these compliment duels were actually licensed. Yep, registered performances where poets had to apply for a public slot, usually tied to festivals or visiting dignitaries. A poetic version of open mic night, with a cultural license to boast. Even stranger, in 12th century Baghdad, it's recorded that bets were placed on the winners of high-profile duels. Imagine slipping a few dinars to your friend and whispering, "I've got 20 on the guy who rhymes lion with loyalty." Tonight's duel drips with polite drama. One poet praises a rival's mastery. Your verses carry light like a lantern's eye. Never too much, never dry. The reply? Equal parts warm and loaded. But your verses? A sunrise caught in silk. Soft to touch, but stronger than milk. Milk? Really? It earns a few laughs, and that's the point. Humor was encouraged. Compliment duels weren't just intellectual. They were theatrical. The best poets made people swoon and snicker. You notice how every line spins toward something bigger than just personal ego. Compliments are couched in imagery that links individuals to nature, to philosophy, even to divine essence. One line you hear compares a person's gaze to a scholar's silence before revelation. That's not just a compliment. That's a compliment in a cape and crown. You catch a quiet moment between rounds, and someone passes you a worn scroll of past duels. You skim a few gems. His feet no geometry, he steps in golden ratios. She is not the rose borrows her fragrance. To drink his words is to forget hunger. Each one a blade wrapped in silk. But the wildest thing, sometimes duels turned into collaborations. Rivals who kept out complimenting each other would join forces. You find one legendary duet from 1197 where two former opponents composed an ode together. The subject? A goose. Don't laugh, it was apparently a very majestic goose. Feathers like a whispering scroll. Wings folded with imperial control. They took turns on the stanzas, trying to outflatter the bird while still maintaining harmony. Historians believe this was part reconciliation, part joint hustle to impress a rich merchant who really liked poultry. And there's your reminder, compliment duels weren't just about art. They were career moves. Impress the right nobleman, and you got a stipend. A robe. Maybe even a seat at court. One poet, rumored to be blind, won a duel so convincingly that he was granted a gold-threaded carpet and an engraved bowl. His opponent, given a goat. Make of that what you will. As the duel you're watching wraps up, the poets clasp hands, not with bitterness, but with shared satisfaction. There's applause, murmured admiration, and a few winks exchanged in the back rows. Because here's the thing, these battles weren't destructive. They were celebrations. Of language, of wit, of mutual skill. Compliment duels didn't humiliate. They elevated. You wander back out into the dusk, your head full of rhymes and metaphors. One last couplet echoes behind you. The tongue may praise, the heart may cheer. But only the poet makes truth appear. It sticks with you. Not because it's flashy, but because it gets to the core of it all. These duels weren't just competitions. They were poetic declarations that words matter, and that how you praise someone says just as much about you as it does about them. You wake to the scent of toasted sesame and the low hum of early prayers rising from a distant minaret. The city is still stretching itself awake when you slip through the narrow lanes toward a small marble courtyard. Today, you're meeting a special breed of poet, the compliment ghostwriter. Yep. Not every verse of flowery praise came straight from the poet's own heart. Turns out, 12th century courts had their own version of a PR team, highly skilled writers who were hired to craft personalized poetic compliments on behalf of others. Think, dear poet, I need a sonnet that makes my uncle feel important, but not too important, and it must include the word peacock at least twice. These ghostwriters were secret weapons in the compliment game. Scribes for hire who could spin silk out of syllables and elevate even the dullest dignitary into something resembling divine. You sit near a fountain where two students are whispering over a shared parchment. They're practicing calligraphy. But the poem? It's a commissioned compliment written by someone else, signed by a merchant hoping to flatter a tax official. Classic. Historians still argue whether ghostwriting was considered shady or just smart. Some sources hint at tension, like poets who publicly shamed clients for tweaking their verses without permission. Others point to anonymous collections where it's clear the practice was expected. Your words weren't your own, they were rented like a velvet robe for a banquet. Here's the real kicker, some of the most famous names in classical poetry may have moonlighted as ghostwriters. There's a particularly juicy scholarly debate about whether Ibn Hamdis, the Sicilian-born poet, secretly penned verses for a sultan's vizier who could barely rhyme moon with spoon. Fringe tidbit. In Cairo, there's evidence of poetic boutiques, tiny stalls where you could walk in, describe your situation, and walk out with a custom compliment scroll, wax-sealed and ready to deliver. Need to impress a teacher? Win back a cousin? Roast a rival while technically complimenting their nose? Done. You glance at a tattered sign above one doorway. Faded ink reads, "Praise made to measure." You can't make this stuff up. Inside, a ghostwriter carefully mixes ink. She dips a fine brush into it, pauses, then continues the final lines of a verse. Though his eyes seek stars, he wears humility like shadow. A man not blinded by his own light. She doesn't smile. This is serious work. Poetry that sounds authentic has to feel authentic. And when your name's not going on it, that's a special kind of craftsmanship. The poet hands the scroll to a boy who takes it and runs off, likely to a noble's estate, where someone will soon pretend they wrote it at sunrise, coffee in hand, staring into the philosophical void. But here's where things get complicated. You find an old letter in a glass case at the madrasa library. It's from a court poet refusing to ghostwrite. In it, he says, "My ink is a vessel of truth, not currency. I will not rent my voice to flatter a fool." Ouch. He was later fired. But he makes a point. Ghostwriting compliments blurs the line between authentic praise and crafted image. Did the merchant truly admire the governor's fairness, or was he just hoping for a tax break? Still, most poets weren't martyrs. They needed coin. And ghostwriting was safer than warfare or caravan jobs. Plus, it offered a kind of invisible power. You controlled how others were perceived without ever being seen. A poet named Basim was legendary for this. He created compliment kits, pre-written verse fragments he could tailor on the spot. You notice something odd about these ghostwritten lines. They're less risky. Fewer metaphors that toe the line. Less sass. Less innovation. Because when you're writing for someone else, you dial it back. You aim for safe admiration, not poetic infamy. This opens another historical thread. Some scholars argue that ghostwriting led to a standardization of praise. Compliments became formulaic, expected, predictable. One modern historian calls it the age of poetic packaging. And you start to see why compliment battles began to splinter into two camps, the bold originalists and the refined ghostwriters. One sought immortal lines, the other immediate favor. But don't get it twisted, ghostwriters weren't lazy. Some were geniuses. Their anonymity meant they could experiment, blend styles, slip in forbidden ideas. A few buried secret messages in the acrostics of their poems. One verse about a noble's beard secretly spelled out "your glory fades down the side." Savage. Hidden. And completely deniable. There's even a story, half legend, half-truth, of a scribe who ghostwrote compliments for two rival patrons at the same time. He made each man sound like the sun incarnate, and neither realized they'd both paid for poems with identical final lines. "The world is lesser in your absence, ask the moon," she blushes. How did the scribe get away with it? Simple. He moved to Damascus. As you wander out into the evening air, you consider the quiet strength of these invisible wordsmiths. They weren't the ones taking bows in banquet halls. Their names rarely survived. But their fingerprints are everywhere. On scrolls. In hearts. In deals made and marriages arranged because of one perfectly turned phrase. You pause beneath a carved lintel and whisper a line to yourself. The most powerful poet is the one you never see. And tonight, that's who we honor. The ghostwriters of compliments. Invisible artisans. Praise merchants. The voice behind the throne, wearing ink-stained sleeves. Night again, but not quite the same as before. This time you walk beneath hanging lanterns, each one swaying gently above an alley strung tight like a harp. The scent of fig smoke drifts past your shoulder. Laughter echoes from somewhere nearby, a tavern, maybe, or a garden gone rogue after sundown. You follow the sound until it leads you into a strange little performance circle. Not quite formal. Not quite casual. Think of it like poetic karaoke. Except the verses, compliments, and the twist, they're disguised as insults. Welcome to the art of ironic praise. Here's the deal, in the 12th century, poets got bored. Predictable compliments, your eyes are stars, your wisdom is oceans, those were everywhere. Too easy. So a few cheeky wordsmiths started flipping the form on its head. They praised with barbs. They lifted you up by pretending to knock you down. You ease into the crowd, where a man with an owl feather in his turban is preparing to speak. His target, a local courtier known for being dramatic. The poet begins with a smirk. "O most modest of men, how you suffer. Clothed in jewels, as if pity were fashion." The crowd chuckles, half offended for the courtier, half thrilled by the cleverness. It's a strange dance, this ironic praise. To mock someone with affection, or to admire someone through insult. Either way, it made for spectacular performances. Historians call it ulmad ulmuban, the hidden praise. But here's the best part, often, the target loved it. Why? Because surviving a roast and still being seen as brilliant was the highest compliment of all. It meant you were secure, powerful, witty enough to handle it. Some patrons even requested this treatment. "Make it funny," they'd say. "Make it sting a little. But make me sound like a legend." You watch a younger poet stand to reply. He raises his voice. "O master of patience, you waited so long to speak. We assumed you'd achieved enlightenment, in silence." Boom. Soft jab. Loud applause. This wasn't about being mean. It was about showing linguistic agility, being able to juggle tone, meaning, and metaphor all at once. Compliments wrapped in sarcasm required precision. One slip and you were just being rude. Here's a fringe detail. In parts of Andalusia, poets practiced these verses using mirror drills, standing in front of polished copper, reciting to themselves in mock admiration. It wasn't just about words, it was about delivery. The tilt of the brow. The breath after the punchline. You pass a group of students trying it out now, mimicking lines with exaggerated faces. One stumbles through. "Your generosity is so vast, we wondered if you'd noticed. Your pockets were still full. Yeah, needs work. But you get the idea." Ironic praise wasn't only public. Sometimes it was exchanged privately, between friends, lovers, or even rivals too polite to outright duel. One preserved letter from 1181 features a poet describing his friend's intelligence as like a night with too many stars, bright, but slightly confusing. Scholars still argue whether this was meant to be charming or insulting. Probably both. That's the beauty of it. And here's the twist. In some cases, women dominated this form. Because when society limited a woman's ability to speak freely, ironic compliments offered a loophole. They could criticize the powerful under the cover of praise. One famous poetess in Aleppo praised a prince's courage in dressing like an oil merchant and got away with it. The prince laughed. But his tailor was fired. It became a kind of poetic jujitsu, using compliments to slip past defenses, flipping social power without ever raising your voice. You pause to watch another exchange. This one's between two friends. One grins, bowing theatrically. "Truly, you speak as a man who has read many books." Aloud, while someone else explained them. Laughter. Eye rolls. Then a bow in return. And you listen like a sage. Though I wonder if the wisdom makes it past the beard. Even the musicians chuckle between plucks of their ouds. You start to notice something deeper here. These ironic compliments, they're not about ego. They're about connection. The intimacy of knowing someone well enough to poke fun at them, and the trust to take it in stride. That's not mockery. That's affection with a sharp edge. It's the difference between you're amazing and you're amazing, despite yourself. Still, not everyone agreed this was noble art. One biographer of the time, grumpy, probably sleep-deprived, complained that these twisted verses ruined the dignity of poetry. He called it a jest passed off as a duel. But the audience clearly disagreed. A fringe note: some poets reportedly kept insult dictionaries, scrolls of clever, barbed phrases that could be reshaped into irony on the fly. Like a thesaurus of sass. One such phrase: his silence is a blessing, it's his voice that tests us. That's rough. And brilliant. You hear a final line before the night ends. My friend is like the desert wind. Invisible, but always somehow knocking things over. The poet grins. The friend bows. And just like that, the crowd melts into the night. You step out under a full moon, heart lighter than it should be after a night of half-insults. But that's the trick. This wasn't about insult or praise. It was about play. About sharpening language until it cuts and heals. A whisper behind you repeats the phrase, "Only true love dares to mock." Yeah, that feels right. Your feet have grown used to the rhythm of these ancient streets. You turn a corner lined with pomegranate trees, and their branches seem to lean in, curious about where your journey is taking you next. Tonight's path leads somewhere unexpected, not to a palace, not to a poet's den, but to a school. A madrasa, to be exact. Because the next chapter of this story, it unfolds in classrooms where students didn't just study grammar or recite the Quran, they trained for compliment combat like it was a mental martial art. Yep. Compliments were taught. And not in a write something nice for your grandma way. No, this was rigorous. Competitive. Think of it like debate club meets rap battle, only everyone's wearing robes and quoting Aristotle. You step into a cool, high-ceilinged study hall where the floor is covered in reed mats. Young students sit in tight rows, bent over parchment. Their instructor, an elder with ink-stained fingers and surprisingly good posture, walks slowly between them, reading as he goes. One student murmurs his line aloud. His wisdom spills like honey, slow, golden, and too much for one mouth. The teacher stops. Nods. Good, he says. But say it with less hunger. You grin. This is serious business. Compliment training began early in elite circles. Aspiring poets had to master not only classical forms like the qasida and ghazal, but also the nuanced etiquette of how to flatter. Which adjectives were honorable? Which were overused? Which could secretly offend someone if spoken in the wrong context? Complimenting a warrior on his grace instead of his bravery? Dangerous territory. One historical fact: in the 12th century, several madrasas in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Nishapur added rhetorical praise modules to their curriculums. These weren't optional. They were considered essential for future scholars, diplomats, even religious leaders. Because in this world, knowing how to praise well meant knowing how to negotiate, persuade, and survive. You listen as the instructor drills his class on metaphorical layering, using natural elements to mirror human traits. He prompts them. Praise a man's loyalty without using the word loyalty. Hands shoot up. He is as the cedar, roots unseen, but strong enough to split stone. Nice. His shadow returns before the sun rises. Chilling, but clever. Another challenge, the compliment flip. Praise through contrast. One student stumbles through. Though his face wears the wind's harshness, his kindness is a garden. The teacher taps his scroll. Good metaphor. Weak delivery. Try again. It's a tough crowd. Historians still argue whether this level of poetic education elevated or diluted the art. Did it create brilliance or just standardize technique? There's evidence that many of the best court poets were trained in exactly this environment. But also whispers that the raw, emotional geniuses, the Sufi mystics, the desert wanderers, they never went near a classroom. That tension shows up even today. You can feel it as a student leans back, muttering under his breath that rules kill rhythm. His friend shrugs. Maybe. But princes don't pay for chaos. Touché. You find a side room filled with old scrolls, records of past compliment tournaments. Yes, those were a thing. Annual contests where students competed for prestige, prizes, and occasionally a really nice cloak. You read one winning line from 1176. He listens as the earth drinks rain. Quietly, and with purpose. Elegant. Understated. You'd hire that kid. But it wasn't just about elegance. Some instructors, particularly in the Eastern madrasas, pushed students to explore philosophical flattery. Compliments that didn't just praise a person's qualities, but why those qualities mattered in the cosmic order. You hear a recitation drifting in from the hallway. His justice steadies the world, as gravity steadies the stars. Now that's poetic physics. And then there's the more bizarre side of training, where students were asked to praise the UN praiseworthy, just to sharpen their skill. The assignment: compliment a man with a terrible voice. One student's attempt: when he speaks, the birds go silent. Not from fear, but reverence. Is that reverence, or shock? Hard to say. But it works. Here's a fringe tidbit. In one forgotten academy near Bork, students trained using scent jars. They'd open a jar containing a strong scent, rose oil, musk, even wet parchment, and write a compliment inspired by it. The goal? Evoke someone's essence through multisensory metaphor. Smells like genius. You step outside into the moonlight with one final lesson echoing in your mind. The instructor, pointing at his chest, had said, "Compliments must come from the heart, but pass through the mind. Do not flatter what you do not understand." That's the rub. Compliment training wasn't just about writing nice things. It was about perception. Attention. Seeing someone clearly enough to say something true, beautiful, and useful all at once. And when you think about it, isn't that the real skill? Anyone can toss sugar-coated words into the wind. But to compliment someone with intention, with precision, empathy, and maybe a tiny joke hidden in the folds, that takes work. And in these madrasas, it was work worth doing. As you leave the school behind, you whisper one of the student lines into the night. He is the quiet between verses. What makes the music matter? And suddenly, your steps feel a little lighter. The scent of ink still lingers on your sleeve as you drift farther from the madrasa, the echo of student voices fading into the hush of midnight. This time, the road curves toward something softer, more intimate. A hidden courtyard framed by jasmine vines and low stone benches, where the moon filters through like a half-remembered song. Here, praise doesn't ring out in public squares or echo across halls. No, this is where flattery becomes private currency, a whisper behind a curtain, a line scribbled into a folded letter, a glance exchanged between eyes that know too much to say things plainly. Tonight, you've stumbled into the realm of secret lovers' praise. Not the grand, showy kind. Not the I'd burn cities for your smile genre. This is subtler, sharper. Praise used to hide affection. Because in the 12th century, love could be dangerous, politically, socially, even spiritually. Especially across lines of class, faith, or family. So what did people do? They praised. Quietly. Cunningly. Lavishly. One real historical example. a noblewoman in Damascus, married into a political alliance, wrote poems to a poet/scribe who had helped her once with a Persian translation. She never used his name. Only metaphors. In one verse she calls him the ink that corrects my silence. Historians still argue whether the relationship was romantic, but come on. That's poetry code for, you see me. You kneel beside a low table where several folded letters lie open. Each is written in elegant, almost bashful script. One reads, "To the one whose absence turns the sun pale. You move through my thoughts like the call to prayer. Gentle, daily, and impossible to ignore." Another simply says, "Your shadow rests beside mine. I do not ask how it got here. See what's happening." Compliments here are safe smuggled feelings. Praise becomes camouflage. When you couldn't say, "I miss you," you said, "Your absence inspires the birds to sing more carefully." Quirky detail. Some couples developed compliment codes, little systems using flower metaphors, animal references, or even fabric textures. Silk meant comfort. Hawk meant protection. Smoke could mean longing or confusion, depending on how it curled into the verse. You find a fragment scratched onto a clay shard. Yep, people reused everything. Your voice wears silk. But your silence speaks hawk. Boom. That's a whole relationship right there. And it wasn't just lovers. Sometimes these covert compliments passed between friends who couldn't publicly support each other. Think of rival poets who secretly admired one another's work but couldn't risk saying it aloud. Or a scholar who praised a Jewish colleague's insight through a poem about the moon that teaches the sun. In many cases, praise was a lifeline. A way of saying, "I see you," when the world didn't. In Cordoba, it's believed that two female poets, one Muslim, one Christian, exchanged compliments hidden in copied manuscripts. They wrote on the margins in a private shorthand that historians are still trying to decode. One fragment reads, "The flower with two roots bends gracefully, and needs no one's permission to bloom." Is that a compliment? A rebellion? Probably both. Here's where it gets extra beautiful. In some courts, servants were trained in the art of whispered praise. Courtiers would send them as messengers, not with physical gifts, but with spoken verses designed to be memorized and delivered like lullabies. Imagine that, sending your feelings on the tongue of a trusted voice. One report from 1193 tells of a eunuch who acted as poetic envoy between two highborn lovers. He reportedly recited this line, "She does not speak of you, but her silence forms your name perfectly." That's not just flattery. That's emotional espionage. Of course, not all secret praise was romantic or noble. Sometimes it was pure mischief. One young poet, trying to win back favor after offending a courtier, anonymously slipped a line beneath the man's door. "Your kindness lingers longer than your anger." Unlike most noblemen, scholars still debate whether that worked. I mean, that's basically ancient "I'm sorry" but also still right. Another fringe tradition, in select Andalusian households, lovers would exchange compliments through shared riddles, lines that only made full sense if you knew the backstory. One carved bracelet reads, "The river that forgets its course still flows to the sea." Sounds cryptic. But for the couple who wore matching ones, that was everything. You settle against a garden wall, warm stone at your back. Around you, snippets of praise hang in the air like the scent of crushed herbs. Some soft, some sly, some aching. She dreams like a scholar, cataloguing stars she'll never touch. His laughter arrives too late, which means he listens. It's strange, isn't it? How a single line can say so much more than 1,000 conversations. In this world, compliments weren't flippant. They were deliberate, carefully chosen. A way to leave fingerprints on someone's memory without ever touching them. And maybe that's what made these secret praises so powerful. They weren't shouted. They were hidden, protected. Like a pressed flower in a forbidden book. You rise, brushing jasmine petals from your cloak. Somewhere in the shadows, you hear a voice murmur a compliment not meant for anyone in particular. He walks like someone who's already been forgiven. OOF. That one hits. You don't say a word. Just smile, and move quietly into the next stretch of moonlight. You're barely a few steps beyond that courtyard of whispers when the atmosphere shifts. The air thickens, not with romance or reverence this time, but with ego. Real, radiant, take up the whole room ego. Because now, you're entering the coliseum of public flattery battles, where compliments weren't whispered behind silken veils, but hurled like expertly polished daggers in front of roaring crowds. Welcome to the poetic tournaments of the 12th century, part performance art, part gladiator match, all delivered in meter and metaphor. You pass under an archway carved with calligraphic verses, and suddenly, you're inside an amphitheater-like courtyard buzzing with anticipation. The audience, scribes, nobles, students, even food vendors, presses close to a small raised platform where two men stand poised like boxers. Except instead of fists, they're armed with compliments. This is Mad al-Mudakara, the praise duel. Historically, events like these were surprisingly common in elite Islamic courts and intellectual salons. Think of them as poetic showdowns, often sponsored by a vizier, caliph, or local patron eager to showcase their court's cultural clout. But unlike satirical roast battles, these poets aimed to outpraise each other. The sharper the metaphor, the more unexpected the flattery, the better the score. One mainstream fact: in 12th century Baghdad and Al-Andalus, these poetic duels were often judged by a panel of scholars who assessed not just the creativity of the lines but their adherence to classical form, the complexity of their imagery, and the subtlety of their allusions. Yes, subtlety. Too much sugar, you lose. The crowd grows quiet. One poet, resplendent in a deep red robe, begins. His wisdom stacks like books in a fireless library, never consumed, but always warming. Oh, that earns scattered nods and one delighted gasp. The other, dressed in a blue cloak stitched with silver thread, counters without pause. Your generosity spills like a broken inkwell. Messy, unstoppable, and staining everything with grace. The audience erupts. You swear someone in the back faints theatrically. Now, here's where things get even wilder. Compliment duels didn't just happen person to person. Sometimes, poets would square off to praise the same third party, often the ruler hosting the event. Imagine two poets battling to see who could flatter the sultan best without sounding like a bootlicker. That's a delicate art. One recorded exchange from Cordoba involves this masterstroke. Poet A. He speaks and the sun slows down. Not to listen, but to avoid competition. Poet B. Even silence bows before him, afraid it might be misheard as disrespect. Historians still argue whether these poets believed what they said or were just exceptionally good at flattery theatre. Some suggest the best lines came from a place of genuine admiration. Others say it was all calculated court survival. Because here's the fringe tidbit: winning a praise duel could earn you not just bragging rights, but land, robes, even political appointments. One poet in Nishapur reportedly won a garden after delivering the line, "He shelters the tired with shade made of promises he keeps." Not bad for a sentence. You lean against a marble pillar, watching another duo take the stage. This time, it's a younger poet versus a weathered veteran. The elder goes first, his voice like dry thunder. Your strength is unspoken, like the spine of a well-read book. The younger one smirks, replies coolly, "Your wisdom hides in plain view, like the sky we forget to thank." The crowd lets out a low whistle. It's a compliment, but also a reminder not to underestimate youth. That's the thing with these duels, they weren't about being nice. They were about being clever, respectful, yes, but also dominant. And then there's the ultimate move, the backhanded compliment masquerading as pure praise. You hear it in a line from one particularly smug participant. "You are so generous, even your enemies leave with gifts." Mostly confusion and self-doubt. Technically flattering. Mostly terrifying. Occasionally, these duels would escalate into spontaneous group battles, praise melees where multiple poets volleyed lines at once. Chaos. Poetry jazz. There's one account from the court of Sultan Sanjar where 7 poets engaged in a compliment chain, each trying to top the last using only sea metaphors. It ended when one dramatically proclaimed, "He commands waves without shouting. Even the tide checks its temper near him." Mic drop. Or scroll drop, rather. You notice a scribe in the corner, feverishly recording the best lines for future study. Because yes, these events were often archived, some poets even published their battle verses in collections with dramatic titles like Tides of the Golden Tongue or The Polished Blade of Praise. You'd buy that, admit it. Interestingly, some battles were actually rehearsed. Scripted duels designed to entertain and elevate both participants. But others were real, unscripted contests where a single off-meter line could spell disaster. There's even a record of a poet who flubbed a metaphor about peacocks and was gently escorted out of town. Dramatic, yes, but poetic dignity was serious business. As the final round ends and the crowd slowly disperses, you notice something peculiar. Despite the competition, the poets embrace. They swap lines under their breath. Compliments layered within compliments. This wasn't war. It was mutual elevation. A public chess match of admiration. You step into the night once more, mind humming with verse. Behind you, the stage is already being swept clean, but echoes remain. He teaches without speaking. He lifts without touching. He rules without ruling. You pause. That one's going to live in your head for a while. The moon dips lower now, casting longer shadows across the narrow path that winds away from the public courtyards and grand arenas. You brush past a fig tree, its branches swaying like a sleepy bow, and step into a quieter, more cerebral world. Here, compliments don't fly in the form of crowd pleasers or smitten riddles. Instead, they slink through books, creep along the margins of scrolls, and cling to parchment like perfume. You've arrived in the scholarly praise circle, a world where intellectuals, philosophers, and scientists used compliments as both sword and olive branch. Unlike the flattery duels of the courts, here praise is subtler, more like an intricate embroidery you only notice if you look closely. It's the equivalent of a nerd high five, except instead of great job, it's more like, your understanding of metaphysical causality is only slightly beneath divine revelation. And yes, that's an actual 12th century compliment. Sort of. You enter a quiet study hall lit with oil lamps and filled with the low hum of parchment being unrolled. A group of scholars sits cross-legged, passing around a freshly translated copy of Aristotle's Metaphysics. One pauses, fingers tracing a note in the margin, and murmurs. Written with such clarity, Ibn Rushd could have translated lightning. Boom. Compliment and science joke. Here, mainstream fact, scholars in the Islamic Golden Age, particularly in Al-Andalus and the Abbasid Caliphate, frequently praised each other in prefaces and marginalia. These weren't just throwaway lines like "to my esteemed colleague." No, these were mini-odes, sometimes full-blown poetic tangents, inserted into treatises on astronomy, medicine, even optics. One such gem, Al-Zarawi, the great physician, referred to his mentor as the scalpel that carves ignorance from the body of the world. Historians still argue whether that was literal or just poetic flair. Either way, talk about a sharp compliment. But praise in this setting wasn't just about adoration, it was also currency. It built alliances, reinforced schools of thought, and often secured manuscript circulation. If you wanted your work copied, quoted, or preserved, you buttered up the right people, preferably in metered verse. Quirky tidbit: one Baghdad scholar famously inserted compliments for rival thinkers into footnotes, hidden little rhymes like, "He disagrees, but with such finesse. I almost wish my point were less." That's academic sass and respect rolled into one couplet. You find a letter spread open near a stack of inkpots, penned by a Sufi scholar to his mathematician friend. Your numbers hum. They dance in harmony with divine breath. I do not understand them, but I believe in them. Imagine getting a message like that after turning in your calculus homework. Now, this isn't to say scholarly praise was all sunshine and stardust. Sometimes it was strategic diplomacy, a means of smoothing over doctrinal differences or political tensions. In 12th century Cairo, two rival jurists publicly disagreed over legal interpretations, but each still referred to the other as the minaret that guides the faithful in thought. Beautiful, yes. Slightly passive-aggressive? Definitely. And sometimes, praise disguised a dare. A nudge to one-up. Like when the Andalusian polymath Ibn Tufail described his student Ibn Rushd, you may know him as Averroes, as the one who listens so completely, he answers questions I haven't asked. That's flattery and a challenge. Now impress me. In fact, a few dusty scrolls in this study hall bear entire praise chains, a tradition where one scholar would include a verse praising another, who would then reply with a new verse in the margin, and so on. One surviving manuscript has over 12 layers of complimentary banter stacked like academic lasagna. It ends with, "If I am a flame, you are the wick. And neither burns alone." You smile at that. It's warm, generous, but also speaks to something deeper, this idea that knowledge, like praise, was a shared pursuit. Not a competition, but a collaboration. Still, even in this scholarly haven, praise wasn't always welcome. One particularly grumpy polymath wrote, "Praise is a veil the lazy throw over flawed thought. I prefer my ideas naked." Okay, chill, Ibn Wet Blanket. Interestingly, some scholars resisted overt compliments, insisting their work speak for itself. But even they couldn't escape the praise ninja tactics of their peers. One philosopher, notoriously reclusive and immune to public praise, once received a simple note tucked into a translated scroll. "Your silence corrects me more than 1,000 sermons." That's poetic stealth mode. As you drift deeper into the study hall, you find a tiny book tucked into a shelf behind some forgotten geometry diagrams. Inside are nothing but single-line praises from anonymous writers. It reads like a secret compliment club, each entry signed only with a symbol. His curiosity infects even the dust he steps on. She teaches like a breeze opens shutters. A question from him is a gift. An answer, an earthquake. You pause, imagining centuries of thinkers building each other up with lines like these, layering admiration into their work not just as homage, but as hope. A gentle suggestion that excellence matters. That kindness and brilliance don't have to be opposites. You take a seat on a cushion near the back, letting your thoughts drift like the scent of old paper and drying ink. Maybe praise, in this world, isn't just about lifting others. Maybe it's about preserving ideas through affection. Embedding warmth in logic. Leaving a trail of kindness in places where debate and reason usually hold sway. And honestly, that feels like the cleverest kind of flattery yet. You rise slowly from that cozy corner of scrolls and scholarly whispers, the scent of ink still lingering in your nostrils like an echo. Your journey isn't over, not yet. There's still one final chamber left to explore. You step back into the open air, where stars blink lazily above rooftops. A cat yawns on a sun-warmed ledge. And far ahead, glowing like a lantern in the mist, waits a hidden archive, the private writings and diaries of 12th century poets. This, you realize, is where compliments were at their most honest. Not broadcast to a crowd. Not designed to win land, robes, or favors. But scratched onto parchment in solitude. Softly folded into the margins of personal notebooks. Hidden beneath layers of metaphors meant only for one reader, sometimes even the poet themselves. You duck into a quiet side room. It's warmer here, lined with shelves made of olive wood and smelling faintly of cinnamon. A scholar sits in the corner, asleep on a pile of unfinished verses. You tread softly, fingers brushing along spines until you find a stack of weathered journals tied with ribbon and brittle wax seals. Inside, secrets. One mainstream fact. Dozens of 12th century Arabic and Persian poets kept personal diwans, manuscript collections of their poetry that often included drafts, unsent letters, private musings, and cryptic dedications. Unlike the polished pieces meant for public performance, these works were raw, emotionally tangled, and often filled with compliments so intimate, you almost feel guilty reading them. You flip one open. A small note to a lover, never sent. You are the delay between my breath and the world. When you enter a room, even the floor forgets to creak. No applause. No arena. Just quiet longing. You turn another page. A strange, meandering entry from a poet whose name has long been lost to history. He writes of a fellow poet, perhaps a friend, perhaps a rival. He writes as if each word carries my name. And yet I vanish behind his every stanza. Historians still argue whether this was admiration, jealousy, or a strange poetic love letter. Maybe all three. Maybe none. The beauty is in the unspoken. You stumble upon one particularly dense diary. Its cover is scratched with a single word, letters. Inside, an entire series of alphabetized poems, each one starting with a different Arabic letter, each praising a different unnamed person. But clues glimmer like breadcrumbs. B is for the brightness of her sighs. J for the jasmine tangled in his logic. R for the room that grows smaller when she leaves. Who were these people? Lovers? Patrons? Ghosts? One quirky discovery, buried deep in the diary, is a folded note in a different hand. Possibly a friend, maybe a spouse. It reads, I know you'll pretend this praise was never for me, but I knew when you wrote about moonlight softening walls. A secret response to a secret compliment. Layered history. Hidden feelings. You pause, heart soft, realizing how much of this world lived not in marble halls or firelit courtyards, but here. In scribbled drafts. In smudged ink. In love that was too complicated or dangerous to speak aloud. Another journal reveals a different kind of intimacy. Not romantic, but spiritual. A Sufi poet writes, God hides in every kind word I say of others. And most clearly, in the words I do not say of myself. A scholar's marginal note responds below. You compliment the creator by admiring his designs, including your neighbor, your enemy, and your own unworthy soul. Even in private, these poets turned flattery into philosophy. You find a scrap of parchment tucked behind the binding, likely never meant to survive. It reads, He spoke gently even to animals. I once watched him praise a donkey's patience. It made me question my own. A whisper of humility wrapped in admiration. Probably not an entry that would have won court prizes. But here, in this quiet room, it's golden. Interestingly, some poets composed entire shadow poems, works that paralleled their public verses but twisted the message in private. A famous case involved a poet who publicly praised a powerful patron for his generosity, while his diary revealed this line. He gives as the sun gives. Too hot, too far, and always expecting thanks. So much for unfiltered devotion. But then, the entries shift again. One poet writes to his future self, complimenting who he hopes he'll become. May you speak slowly, like wisdom unrolling. May your anger cool into patience, and your praise be earned before it's given. That one stays with you, like a lullaby for the soul. Fringe tidbit: a few poets even tried compliment spells, verses meant to magically enhance someone's beauty, memory, or mood. One scrawled charm reads, "By this ink, I double her smile. By this rhyme, I soften his pride. By this praise, may love return like spring to dry roots." Historians still argue whether this was superstition, creative therapy, or just lonely people hoping words could do what actions could not. You finally come to one last page. Bare. Except for a single line, written in a slightly shaking hand. All my praise was a way to stay close, even when I couldn't stay long. It's unclear who it was meant for. A lover, a lost friend, maybe even the divine. But it sits there like a candle still burning after everyone's left the room. You step away, heart full, eyes heavier than you realized. It's strange, isn't it? How the most powerful praise is often the kind never meant to be heard. Out here, under a velvet sky, you realize this. In a world obsessed with grandeur and performance, it's these quiet, private compliments, the ones whispered into parchment or slipped into empty margins, that may be the most enduring. They outlast wars. They outlast empires. They live in ink and longing and the stubborn hope that someone, someday, might read them and understand. And you just did. Your journey nears its end now, and the world around you has grown hushed. The walls of the ancient poetic arenas, grand courts, and candlelit libraries all blur into a softer memory. But you're not quite ready to leave, not until you peek behind the last, most curious curtain of all, the modern echoes of these ancient compliment duels. Because whether you realize it or not, their legacy is still alive in memes, battle raps, tweets, wedding toasts, and even that one time your friend called your outfit criminally flawless. Yeah, that. You step into a flickering liminal space, part 12th century bazaar, part 21st century message board. Hanging above you are banners made of languages old and new, stitched together by compliments as fierce as they are funny. Here's your mainstream fact. Scholars widely agree that the tradition of verbal one-upmanship through praise didn't die with medieval poets. It evolved. In fact, there's a clear line running from those ancient arenas of complimentary dueling to the modern compliment battles seen in improvisational comedy, hip-hop, and yes, even friendly roasts. Think of Wild 'N Out or freestyle rap circles. When someone says, "You so smart, you make Einstein look homeschooled," you're hearing the spiritual descendant of a 12th century poet telling his rival, "Your words polish truth like the moon cleanses shadow." Both are outrageous. Both are affection disguised as challenge. One open scholarly debate today: whether these poetic flattery contests were genuinely meant to uplift, or if they masked deeper rivalries, territorial claims over style, patronage, and fame. Some argue that compliment duels were safer ways to wage war. Others say they were essentially emotional peacocking. Historians still can't quite decide. But you're starting to see that it can be both. Take the story of a 12th century poet who praised his rival's handwriting by saying, "Your pen dances like a reed kissed by wind, mine merely limps behind it." Modern version: "Bro, your calligraphy got more curves than a racetrack." Still a compliment. Still competitive. Still oddly sweet. Quirky tidbit: there's a social media trend in certain Arabic-speaking regions where people hold flattery duels online, posting poetic couplets complimenting each other's wisdom, humor, even cooking skills, sometimes escalating into full-blown odes over who can best honor the other. One viral thread included a man comparing his friend's shawarma to a gift from the heavens. The friend replied, "If my meat sings, It's because your fire composed the melody. Culinary praise war. Michelin stars optional. You scroll through these exchanges, realizing just how much of our digital age echoes with those same rhythms. Compliments in the form of TikTok comments like "you're the reason mirrors exist" or tweets like "her laugh deserves its own religion" carry the same exaggerated, affectionate energy of poets praising their rivals' metaphor game. Even romantic texting, yes, that emoji-laced art form often mirrors 12th century flirtation poems. "Your voice is my favorite" sound could have just as easily been inked onto parchment next to a wax seal and a pressed rose. But perhaps the most heartwarming modern equivalent: wedding speeches, best man toasts, maid of honor stories. You've heard it. He makes her laugh like no one else can, or she brings out the best in everyone she meets. Strip away the microphones and fancy shoes, and you're back under a starry sky, with a poet standing up to praise someone they love, not for glory, but because it's true. Because it matters. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes it's nice to say, "You are extraordinary," with your whole chest. There's even evidence that modern authors still sneak praise into dedications and acknowledgements in their books, just like those 12th century scholars writing love letters to their mentors. Only now it sounds like, "To my partner, who makes words worth writing," or "For the professor who made me believe I could." Compliments are coded into everything. Even insults sometimes hide them. You know those roasts where the joke is technically mean, but somehow weirdly flattering? Like, "He's so smart, it's annoying," or "She's got more charm in one eye roll than most people do on their best day." That's a compliment duel. Just with modern seasoning. It's fascinating how something as ancient as poetic praise continues to shift with the times. Back then it was odes and incense. Today it's Canva graphics and all caps Instagram captions. But the essence, the intention, that lives on. You wander through a virtual hallway of screenshots, tweets, and DMs, their text glowing softly. "You're the plot twist I didn't know I needed. If I had a penny for every time you amazed me, I'd build you a castle. Your mind should come with a warning, too bright to stare at directly. You smile." Somewhere, a 12th century poet is clapping. Or writing a reply in elaborate calligraphy with a gold-tipped quill. At last, you sit on a digital cushion that shifts and glows beneath you. The world of compliments, past and present, now stretches behind you like a long river of stardust and rhyme. And maybe now you understand what they were really doing, those ancient poets with their elaborate verses and velvet words. They weren't just showing off. They were creating connections. Quiet bridges between hearts. Whispers passed between generations. Praises so beautiful they survived everything else: war, famine, time, and found their way to you. And now, maybe it's your turn to say something lovely. Just because. Now your eyes begin to grow heavy. You stretch slightly, breathing deeper, slower, the rhythm of your heart matching the softened silence around you. Let the imagery of tonight begin to melt: poets with sly smiles, torches flickering on ancient walls, scrolls of ink and gold curling gently in the corners of your mind. Let it all fall away. The echoes of flattery, once loud and triumphant, now dissolve into hushes and soft laughter. Even the most elaborate compliments grow quieter, smaller, like a candle flickering down to its last warm glow. And in their place, there's a stillness, a comfort, a sense that kindness, when shared through art, through word, through thought, can echo forever, even when everything else is gone. You lie back now, head sinking into your pillow, the room around you dim and still. Outside, maybe a breeze stirs the curtains. Maybe a car hums in the distance. But inside, there's only quiet. The quiet of centuries of poets, scholars, lovers, and thinkers all choosing to say something beautiful, even when they didn't have to. And maybe that's the secret. Not just how they battled with praise, but why. To hold someone up for a moment. To celebrate. To remind the world that elegance and softness can be powerful, too. So breathe in. Slowly. Exhale. Gently. And drift off, knowing that somewhere, centuries ago or maybe just yesterday, someone once wrote a few kind words. And meant them.